Thank you very much. I somehow, during an active and reserve career in the Navy, never made it to Norfolk. Never was stationed there, not even for temporary duty, but I managed to marry a Norfolk girl in the process, so I ended up with ties to Norfolk and the Virginia Beach area in any case. The Coalition for Smarter Growth has now been around for about 13 years. While we were founded by conservation groups, we've built strong partnerships with the business community, including through the Washington Smart Growth Alliance. And through that alliance, we've endorsed a significant number of smart growth developments representing tens of thousands of housing units, millions of square feet of development, much of it transit-oriented in the D.C. region. We've also played a key role in really changing the region's debate. The Business Journal made us a Business Person of the Year one year, and then Green Business Visionary finalists another year. The Council of Governments has recognized our work. And we're essentially, often partners with the Greater Washington Board of Trade and other business groups, in addition to our conservation partners, in creating a more sustainable way to grow in the Washington, D.C. region. When I was being interviewed for the newspaper article, the reporter, she liked the concept of my being a voice from the future you do not want. Now, you're a good part of the way there, unfortunately, but the Washington, D.C. region certainly is known for having worse traffic congestion than this area. I think you've got a couple of targeted places where it is particularly bad. I surveyed it tonight, and it's pretty good. You've got pretty good traffic congestion here, as in bad traffic congestion. And we have a lot of lessons learned. I spent the part of this past week, as I was preparing, talking to some activists in the community, as well as talking to the city, reviewing the information that's available on all your planning efforts. And I actually came away very impressed with what Virginia Beach is doing. You're all headed in the right direction. And in fact, I will not name the county in Northern Virginia that has a lot of money and a strong population, but you're given a run for the money in good planning, linking land use and transportation and urban design. So I am very hopeful. It's been, I've been seeing this change over the years. I probably first came down for maybe some Sierra Club things a decade ago to the area. You are working on your own blueprint for a better region, like we have in the Washington, D.C. region. This is the Coalition for Smarter Growth's name for it. Our regional council of governments now has a region forward plan, which is all about a sustainable way to grow in the Washington, D.C. region. So let me get into it, and let me talk a little past, a little future, and offer you a lot of opportunities to address transportation issues. Well, there we have the Washington Beltway, 1968. There we have the Washington Beltway 2000. I don't know if that's progress or not. And there's the Washington Beltway 2010. I should get a current picture rather than just their illustration, but they're actually putting the finishing touches on the final ramps to this right now as part of the Hot Lanes project, the high occupancy toll lane project. Original estimate was going to be $150 to $200 million for this when they estimated it about a decade ago. It's easily $700 million and probably more when you count all the ramps. About 50 overpasses. 2 winters ago, because they didn't pay for the built-in de-icing equipment and they poorly sanded and salted it, they had massive problems. Slip and slide ramps is what these were. The longer-term question is, what's the long-term maintenance cost of this piece of construction? The other lesson of it is a typical sort of approach of fix a problem in one place but push the bottleneck down the road. So if anybody's been up there, just past this interchange, as you try to go around to the big job center of Tyson's Corner, it comes to a screeching halt every morning between 7 a.m. and 9:30 in the morning. The hot lanes may or may not address that. I doubt it would address it for very long. The total price tag, if we add all of this stuff up, if the Marylanders tried to do the same thing, it could be $15 billion for this, and I don't think we'll necessarily be any better off. We know the Wilson Bridge has been $2.4 billion, Springfield Interchange $700 million. Beltway Hot Lanes maybe about $2 billion total, counting what we're going to pay in tolls and taxes for it. So this is adding up to a lot of money just for that. Many have said, well, the only solution is to bypass all of this. Unfortunately, it's not the through traffic that's the problem. We have met the enemy, as Pogo said, and he is us. This is all local commuters, really. So if you create bypasses, and one of them is in the northern arc of the Washington, D.C. region, the Intercounty Connector, you may not solve it. There's the existing beltway again, and here's what the environmental study said. none of the ICC alternatives will have a substantial impact on the levels of congestion experienced on the big roads, you know, basically the Beltway and the other big interstates. But they built it in any case. We'll see what happens. Well, you know, this does bring up one theme. I'm going to probably run through this. And I've heard this quote, and I've been trying to track it down. If not, I'll just claim it. But it was supposedly a British lord who said, and it may have been in the 1950s when England was having some problems. He said, "Gentlemen, we are out of money. Now it's time to think." And I think kind of that's where our country is today. We do have to think very carefully about what we build, where we build, where we grow, and how we grow. And that's the big theme here. So one of the problems when we talk about transportation and we talk about, you know, the worst congested regions and there's so much traffic and the transportation agencies scramble to add some capacity, so we never ask why is our traffic growing so much? What are some underlying causes and what do we do about it? Look at the left two bars in particular. This was over about a 20-year period in the late 70s to the mid-90s, late 90s. Population versus driving. The amount of driving in the second bar is growing 2 to 3 times the rate of our population growth. And in fact, the last Virginia Energy Plan said, for Virginia, vehicle miles traveled have risen 3 times the rate of our population growth. That, of course, leads to massive delay. We can never keep up with it with road capacity. This came from actually the Texas Transportation Institute that always ranks our places. So why is that? Why so much traffic? Well, one is the way we spread out. On the left is the Chesapeake Bay Foundation's study with the University of Maryland, tracking zoning trends. That was in 2000, and this was their prediction for 2030 under current trends. I used to cycle back and forth, but I put them on one table. But, you know, development follows roads. Development expands out of each of the areas. Just to orient you, you know, that's Washington, D.C., that's Baltimore, that's Waldorf, Maryland, Fredericksburg here, Stafford County, Prince William, Loudoun. So, and that's Frederick, Maryland, and Hagerstown, Maryland. It is getting pretty far out there. The Washington region probably reaches into the environs of West Virginia at this point in terms of its draw. Your region has been spreading out as well. There's a good chance that this is going to stop, and is stopping relatively quickly. That's one reason for our traffic, how far out we've gone. The second is the way we've built our communities and what our daily lives are like. You know, when it's animated, the little car runs around. Soccer mom, soccer dad have a pretty busy life trying to get to all the daily needs. Everybody does, whether they have kids or not, because things are all separated. So we pick on Centerville, Virginia, up in Northern Virginia, because it's called Centerville and there's no center anymore. And there may have once been a crossroads called Centerville. But it has all the components of a village. You know, you have shopping, you have a church right here, you have type of homes here, you have a different type over here, offices. But there's no way to get from A to B except on 2 major arterials, and maybe they'll connect this one around here somewhere. But you're not going to have your kid bike or walk over here. You're not going to walk or bike over here. You're going to get in your car, and then the transportation agencies are going to be asked to keep widening this road and putting in double and triple left-hand turn lanes and things like that to get around to things. And then we have our high-tech Dulles corridor, but I think it's pretty low-tech when it comes to urban planning. You have single-use office parks. The parking lots often take up more land than the buildings themselves. People have to drive to lunch. There are homes here, but there's no retail, no restaurants, that sort of thing. The red line is where the Dulles Rail is going to go out in Phase 2. We've had some real questions in this case because the right-of-way is so wide, the walking distance is longer from any activity to the station. You really want to focus your development in the key quarter mile and then half mile, stepping down to the half mile as you build your rail. If the walk is really interesting and you do good urban design, you can even walk longer distances for sure. But here it's about a quarter mile just to get out of the right-of-way. So they still have to, I'm being from Missouri for this one, you've got to show me that this one is going to work out here. Tyson's were well on the way to doing it right. They've got to do a lot here with the Silver Line. So what does this mean when we separate everything? It means we build lots of places to park our cars. They need lots of homes. Someone once said Houston had 40 parking spaces for every car. You know, they're an oil city, right? So, but we all do. We save a lot of parking spaces for our cars, and every lot seems to have to be sized for the Christmas rush. So you see many parking lots are half empty. The good news here is people want an education, so these parking lots are apparently very full. But you have big shopping center parking lots. You have office park parking lots, other shopping center parking lots. These are all Fairfax County. I'm going to pick on Fairfax for a minute, but it's the way we've built many of our communities. And not surprisingly, it's hard to walk between things when things are this spread out. It's not often very pleasant or safe to walk across large parking lots. We consume a lot of land we lose for parks, land we use for housing opportunities for people of all income levels, pushes housing farther away. It is a direct result of the mobility and flexibility of the automobile, but it has come with some challenges in terms of where do we put them at all times, how do we move them around efficiently when there's so many of them, and so forth. So this is the Route 1 corridor in Fairfax, a mall, shopping center in need of much revitalization. There are many of those around the region. And as a result, these places have become very pedestrian friendly, as you see. I don't know if you see the look of fear on their faces over here as they cross. Now, I actually took a walking tour in Tysons with a group of 45 people, and I survived with all 45. I had a good head count at the end. First time ever we did try a walking tour in the Edge City. We actually walked this where the sidewalk gives out and the high-speed entrance and exits are, and we had to walk along here and then find the crossings. The crossings were at least a half-mile apart. That's why people took a shortcut. So if they were hit, they'd be blamed, but the police report would rarely ever say anything about the design of the roadway, the distance between the crosswalks, and so forth. Not a safe roadway for pedestrians. Or how about this one, Route 7 in Bailey's Crossroads in Northern Virginia. I know you've got your share of these in the Hampton Roads region as well. Nice sidewalk here. Now the good news is VDOT has really come along, and as many local counties and cities have as well, in pushing for what we call complete streets, ensuring all users can use them, that there are sidewalks, that there are bike lanes, that there's room for transit as well. And so VDOT has a policy now that they will not build a new road or do a major reconstruction of a road without retrofitting it for pedestrians and bicyclists. And this shouldn't happen. I mean, this is, look at this. Note the nice sidewalk. Here's a kid, going to school, and this is Route 1 in Fairfax. And hopefully this isn't happening anymore, that we're building places like this, but we still have plenty of places to retrofit. And so, not surprisingly, parents won't let their kids walk to school anymore. What we're all trying to do is change that with a national Safe Routes to School program. Let's start with, if we're going to put sidewalks and bike lanes and safe crossings anywhere, let's do it to and from our schools. Again, this is all about why so much traffic. So, how far we spread out, how much we've separated things, how much we've made it hard to walk and bike are all contributors to that. Another piece of it are jobs housing imbalances within our regions. And now I don't know enough about the geographies here, the demographics, where the jobs and housing are located, and the commute patterns. But in the Washington, D.C. area, we have a very clear east-west jobs divide. And it's not just between the full east side of D.C. and Prince George's County, but even in Fairfax County, the southeastern side has not received all the benefits that the Dulles Corridor has in economic development. What that means are things like, first of all, here's the job growth difference between East and West in the D.C. region, which is astounding. But this is what it means. Look at the Beltway there on the left. That's the northern part of the Beltway in Maryland. The traffic reporters report every morning diligently about these backups in the outer loop, but none of them seriously understand why that is and why the other side is empty. And it took over a decade for our regional governments to admit there weren't enough jobs in the east side of the region. And the Washington Post finally wrote about it in October 1st, 2009. And so for traffic relief, the region told to go east. So what a lot of the message is, especially when our country is broke, that if we address things smartly, particularly with the location of development and looking at things like jobs housing balances, we can make a very real difference. In fact, our Council of Governments just released a report 2 weeks ago. The reporters and the press loved the big headline about toll roads, that they were going to build like 1,600 miles of toll roads around Washington, D.C., adding these high-occupancy toll lanes in the middle of everything. Bad enough that the price tag of that was $52 billion. But the other problem was that they didn't report on the fact that there was a companion land use study that was done separately, which said that if we simply filled up our planned activity centers in the region, a lot of which had transit, others needed some transit connections. But if we did mixed-use walkable development in these places, we would reduce the amount of driving and we'd significantly increase walking, biking, and transit use. It was a better transportation solution and a heck of a lot cheaper than $52 billion. So we've got another problem in this, and this is where I come back to my Navy hat and the national security background I have, our oil dependency, U.S. oil consumption. You see a consumption rise, our own production decline, and our net imports increase. We are less than 5% of the world's population, yet we use 25% of the world's oil. As a military man, as someone who's been in the Navy, you know we have had a very large military to preserve the sea lanes, access to the sea lanes, keep countries stable that supply oil to us. It's a big deal. That dependency, it means that, well, as part of that dependency, 70% of the oil that we use goes to transportation of all modes, but a lot of it goes to our cars and our trucks on the roadways. 60% plus is imported. So it's a huge problem that we face. It is a national security problem. It's also an economic problem because when gas prices spiked, we became net exporters of more dollars. Of course, they were recycled to us in loans for our real estate, but when we actually sent the money out to buy oil, that went out of the country. The Europeans took their gas taxes and invested it in more robust transit. And so they were not as affected by the gas price shock of 2007 and had options. We had commuter buses that were full and people waiting by the side of the road because we couldn't fit them all in Northern Virginia because of the high gas prices. Another issue that we all face is neglect of existing infrastructure. While we're busy building a lot of big new stuff, we had forgotten to maintain what we've already built. And of course, the bridge collapse is significant in Minneapolis. A year or so ago, during the stimulus debate, Virginia ran a number that they have 3.5 billion in structurally deficient bridges in the state. That's 2 years after this bridge collapse when Virginia came up with this. $1 billion in deficient pavement. Looks like they're making a lot of progress on the deficient pavement part right now based upon the construction you see out there. I don't know how well we're doing on the bridges. But it's not just the roads, it's our water and sewer systems, which are aging not just in our cities, but in our oldest inner suburbs. You know, those suburbs built in the 50s and 60s have some pretty old water mains, and you see a lot of water main breaks and sewer line breaks and so forth. In the D.C. area, it's billions of dollars in the city and the inner suburbs to replace aging water and sewer lines. So a lot of our philosophy is a fiscal conservative, fix-it-first philosophy, and there's a reason to promote investment in private and public in existing communities so that you can replace aging infrastructure. So here's some of the ranking from the American Society of Engineers of how we're doing on our existing infrastructure. It's not very good, and the kids who go to school here would fail if they got grades like this. The impact on our families is huge as well. This is AAA. These are AAA's numbers, and $9,500 a year to own and operate a medium-sized car driven about 15,000 miles a year. Car, insurance, gas, maintenance, all the registration, titling, all the things a car costs, depreciation, and so forth. That's a lot of money. If you have to own more than one car in your family because of where you live, or even 3 cars when the teenagers are there, and if they'd be trapped if they didn't have one, that gets pretty expensive. That's money that's not available to invest in a business. It's not available to save for your kids' college education. So again, great flexibility with the automobile. We need them. They're very helpful to us in many things that we do. If we could reduce, though, our automobile ownership needs and costs, we could save a lot of money to invest in other things in our economy. And then another connection here to the housing crisis that we had. The CEOs for Cities report by a guy named Joe Courtwright, who has his own consulting firm, indicates that in his view, the huge increase in the gas price was sort of the last straw that break the camel's back of the real estate bubble. Now, it may not have been the case for everybody. There were lots of different reasons for the real estate collapse, but certainly for outer suburban areas, the long commutes ended up being really hard for people to afford if they had to drive. So we want to think about the future. We face all of these challenges. I don't want to be doom and gloom. I'm an American optimist, and I think there's a lot of things that we can do, both learning from the past and thinking about the future, of what we can do with our communities and, in terms of where and how we grow and how we design our communities. So we're thinking about their future. We're thinking about the kids, but not just them. We're thinking about our own future as well. This is a couple walking in Reston Town Center in the Washington, D.C. area, a very walkable, mixed-use urban center that has evolved quite nicely. There is the senior tsunami right there. If you notice that interesting 2011-2012 time period, you notice if you go back in time from, if you're a 65-year-old at that point, you were born right after World War II, when we got back to life again in the U.S. and had the baby boom. So what we're seeing, though, in market demand and what the real estate industry is saying year after year now is that we're going to have a lot more empty nesters, a lot more young professionals, a lot more retirees, a lot of people who are looking to downsize live in places that are lower maintenance, and to live, in many cases, if they can, a lifestyle where they have more options to walk and bike and get around by transit. Right now, AARP is actually very worried about what's going to happen to seniors in suburban communities and rural communities both, who may really become trapped in their homes when they can no longer drive. And it's very hard to deliver services when you're having to reach a very spread out area. So it's going to be a real challenge. We need to be able to create places and options for people within communities. We can't do this unless we plan together. The best planners at the jurisdictional level and the best consultants around the country do this sort of interactive planning where we design our communities, we address all these challenges together, think about our options, whether it's the neighborhood scale to the regional scale. Back in 2005, our organization was invited by the Urban Land Institute to organize a one-day reality check exercise. A bunch of leaders got to play Legos for the day, and essentially we were trying to allocate I think it was 1.6 million new jobs and 2 million people on a board of the entire mega region that is the Washington, D.C. region. Each Lego was 1 square mile, a square one. Lego loved us, so we bought bags of them. It was a very interesting exercise that happened, and the common principles that we agreed upon were to preserve and protect open spaces, focus development near transit stations, transportation corridors in existing towns, create mixed-use development and nodes, provide more housing options, and address and maintain the jobs housing balances within communities to reduce the commute distances. I mean, indicative of the participants, the 300 participants, you had a former AOL executive and philanthropist, civic activist who later became a member of the Board of Supervisors in Loudoun County, the former mayor now of Washington, D.C., he was the mayor at the time, and a civic activist and conservationist from Prince William County. In a sense, what the Council of Governments in our region has reinforced is something that the Chesapeake Bay Foundation found back in 1996 in an analysis using the regional traffic model, that if we did transit-oriented development, taking advantage of our metro rail system and our commuter rail system and so forth, we would get all of these great reductions in vehicle trips, vehicle miles traveled, vehicle hours of travel, and actually help highway speeds. So by giving people options, and the transit option and the option to live and work in places accessible by transit and were walkable, we would reduce the pressure on our roadways in the future. And now the D.C. region is very fortunate. We admit it, and we all appreciate all your tax dollars that have supported by building the metro rail system. I do have to, anywhere I go in the country, I have to thank everybody because, you know, the country helped pay for our nation's capital to have a very proud metro system, one that's old now and that we're trying to, we're playing catch up on maintenance on. At the same time, it's been very successful in focusing development in the region. We have 117 stations counting our commuter rail, Purple Line that's going to start at some point in Maryland in the northeast corner of this, so lots of opportunities, and the green dots are the Dulles Rail Line being built out that way. Just one story from the metro rail system is downtown Gallery Place. We had in 1993, this is even all of them, lots of vacant lots and surface parking right in the heart of the city. Most of us didn't go down there at night at all, and we didn't go down there in the daytime because there was nothing there to do. Not a thing. What happened was Mr. Poland came in with his Washington Wizards and built, and he paid for the new arena on top of the center. It's called the MCI Center, now it's the Verizon Center. And all of this development has occurred on all these parcels. And so you see structures like this, and you'll see the Verizon Center right behind on this. This is right by Chinatown, hence some of the Chinese motif here on the left. And look at all the people on the streets. This place is packed day and night now. It's really a center of the city. A huge amount of real estate investment right on top of this one metro station. It sits right below the center there. And they preserved historic buildings as part of this, create some very interesting streetscapes. Look at the business people. It's become a very big draw. Last time we checked, there were nearly 20 million square feet of development just here and on one metro station, nearly 3,000 housing units, $6 billion in investment for just one of our metro stations. Now that metro system probably cost about $10 to $12 billion to build the first whole chunk of it before you got to the Silver Line. This is just the investment that is followed at one metro station. We like to do this when we talk to people in the suburbs about why cities are important to us. There's the Gallery Place development area. That circle of 1,300 acres is the approximate size of that development had it been built in a standard suburban pattern. with our shopping centers and the parking lots and the separate office buildings, separate residential and so forth, and all the roads and stuff that we needed to do it. That's a lot of land, and look how much of DC it would have taken up. Or if you're living in Herndon, and you'll see Herndon has its own mini beltway here. There's the town of Herndon. There's the 1,300 acres. There's the 25 acres of Gallery Place. So if we really want to preserve open space in our regions and our suburbs, there's a lot we can do to focus development and help revitalize our cities. So this is why a conservationist becomes a big fan of urban revitalization and transit-oriented development. We have a national story of great recognition to Arlington's, Roslyn, Ballston, and Crystal City corridors. There are the corridors. There are 5 stations. They're all no more than a half mile, maybe one's about a 3/4 mile apart, so it's easy to walk to either one. Ballston in the front, Roslyn all the way in the back there, and the city right beyond, right here. And in the 1970s, they had 75 community meetings planned for the future. The story about this is interesting and applies to just about any other jurisdiction in the country. They were losing jobs and population. They were in decline in the 1970s. They had a mall right here in this area called Parkington. That's how we named our malls in the early days, but they got beat out by the later malls in Fairfax County, and it was failing. And what they said is we have to do something. When Metro Rail's proposed, originally it was going to go out the middle of I-66, which curves over here. They said, no, we're going to spend our own money, and we spend more money to put it underground. The result was that they put it right under their old commercial centers, and they were able to revitalize it. This picture is old because this is under development, this is developed, that's developed, that. I mean, it's just amazing. And there's still empty lots in Arlington that they'd have to take care of. How about Roslyn in its day of pawn shops and some houses of ill repute right here, and oil storage? There's Roslyn today. And Roslyn today is about to get another a rebirth for a second time. They're going to go to even taller buildings and replace some of the older buildings because there's so much demand to live in Roslyn. And they're restoring a pedestrian-friendly and a truly vibrant streetscape. And then this other place here is Courthouse, the government center, which is getting a lot of mix of uses. And this is Ballston, the first station that I showed you in the first picture. There's a park by Ballston, which is their old place. They had a general store and a trolley turnaround, and that's 3 blocks from Ballston. They kept their promise to the community. They've really enhanced the property values of these houses here. None of us can afford that bungalow anymore because it's so convenient. But they did keep the promise, and you can very quickly transition, not even notice the change to the heights of the buildings. This is not that many years ago. This is the 1980s. This is an old Sears store right here with a huge parking lot. This building became Freshfields and then Whole Foods. All of this now has been developed. Now, these 2 buildings are now being finished up right now as we speak. This is slightly farther west in the thing. This is George Mason's Law School. They've now added on here. There's churches added on. We still have a lot of these parking lots. And the vision is to fill it all in, have green spaces in key places along the corridor. Green streets is part of it. Here's some illustration from an oblique view. And this is based upon all community input for what the future of Clarendon could be in the heart of the Roslyn-Ballston corridor. Here's the Market Common. This is the old Sears parking lot. This is one of the most successful mixed-use real estate developments in the country. 8 years ago, it sold for $167 million. And it's got apartments and condos above, ground floor retail on the backside of the Barnes & Noble. Buffering the neighborhood are townhouses. And the park has been a very successful part of this whole project. So what are the redevelopment results? They go from 22,000 jobs to 94,000 jobs, millions of square feet of development, 7,000 housing units to 24,500, more downtown office space than Dallas, Denver, or Pittsburgh in this corridor from this transition to that, all on existing paved over land. Conservationists love this stuff, right? But fiscal conservatives should love this stuff too, and here's why. 2 TOD corridors, Crystal City and the Roslyn-Ballston corridor, 11% of the land area, and 50% of the property taxes. I was having a discussion with this earlier, and I think a third of the tax base comes just from the Roslyn-Ballston corridor, and combined 50% of the property tax come from this. It means they have the lowest residential property tax rates in the D.C. region. They also have some of the highest levels of service. And one of the unforeseen things in this, one of the things I hadn't thought about, which would apply to as you're thinking about your own light rail line, is that this TOD corridor, its revenues from the parks, libraries, school streets, recreation centers, all those other services for all the suburban neighborhoods in Arlington as well. So they're getting much enhanced services thanks to this sort of jobs and economic engine. You can't do it without doing all the pieces right. You've got to get the streets right. You've got to have wayfinding. You have to have other transit services. You end up with great streets with cafes. You have bike lanes, great walkability. And I take people on walking tours, and you can see where they haven't done it yet, and there's a huge difference between where they fixed it and where they haven't fixed the old corridor. And then car sharing becomes possible in this. This is Zipcar, which is now spreading to college campuses in Virginia. This is a car sharing program. Steve Case, former AOL executive, is a major investor in it. Arlington and other jurisdictions have figured out that just putting one Zipcar on the street can remove 8 to as many as, I think, 16 to 18 cars from the community. As people say, forget it, I don't need a car, I don't need the headache, I don't need to worry about parking it, I don't have to worry about maintaining it. I can reserve a car online and have it when I need it. And of course, you do other things in many communities. It's not just Metro Rail, it's light rail. This is Portland's streetcar. And then there's bus rapid transit options as well. I'm not going to do this as a transit presentation, just so you know. I'm trying to give you the big picture. In fact, I should say that with those presentations coming up from the center, you'll have one from the state of Oregon on street design and policy. You'll have one of the premier practitioners of creating pedestrian-friendly environments, Dan Burden, who is a not-to-be-missed speaker. And then you're going to have the Virginia Department of Rail and Public Transit talk about transit systems. I'm going to try to focus more on the linkages between land use and transportation. They will get into those details for you. The Arlington corridor has also achieved huge transit ridership. Look at Arlington. The only thing that's really beating them is New York City. And this is for what was a suburb, and it's just huge progress. So you can live in a place like D.C., Arlington, Alexandria, Bethesda in Maryland, and soon, hopefully, places in Fairfax without having to always have to take a car. And it gives you a lot more freedom in a busy metropolitan area because of the variability of traffic, the uncertainty of it. You never know if you make it. The transit has proven to be a little much more reliable. The other story about what happens with why doing development with transit is so important is captured here. This is the walk to transit in the Roslyn-Ballston corridor. That's the walk to transit in the next 4 stations out there in Western Arlington and in Fairfax, right here. This is driving to those more suburban stations. This is the driving to the, and a lot of that's just drop-off of people, one spouse dropping off another in the corridor. So you have a huge gain in walking and biking when you do transit-oriented development. You've got to do the development with it if you want to maximize the ridership and get the maximum from the taxpayer dollars. It's happening in other places in the D.C. region. This is a development at Shady Grove Metro called King Farm, and with ground floor retail apartments above. But part of King Farm are also these very large houses around a very large town green with lots of recreation space. And an unintegrated office building back here, but we're going to work on things like that, connecting them. This is Twinbrook, an illustration with a town green in the middle, right at the metro station here, with the highest buildings are closest to the station, and then they'll step down. But it's not just transit-oriented development at the big metro rail stations that's important. It's also, what do we do with the commercial corridors of our nation? We have lots of them. If our suburban neighborhoods are built, and we love our suburban neighborhoods, they have lots of grown trees now, they're very pleasant places, where does the population growth occur? How do we have it take place without adding to our traffic congestion? And also, how do we meet this market demand from downsizing empty nesters, retirees, young professionals? Not all of it can be on a heavy rail system because we can't afford to build that many of them. We build them in the key places, but then we think about these corridors. This is the Route 1 corridor in Fairfax. Huntington Metro is right here, the end of the yellow line right there. That's getting some development around it. There's some hills up to here, so a nice run for transit might be here. But we basically went and mapped the commercial areas up and down the corridor out of our office and figured out that the whole thing has at least 624 acres. It could be much more. We were conservative in our estimate. That's one-story buildings and parking lots. Beacon Hill Mall is a good example. You have views to the Washington Monument from this place. So this is some pretty valuable real estate we're not using very well. Kings Crossing. Unfortunately, a mixed-use development here, the community didn't get behind soon enough, and that's going to be replaced. This building is now going to be a Walmart. Now, this is going to be an urban Walmart because Walmart's discovered the urban market, the young professionals, the empty nesters, the downsizers. This is going to be a Walmart, mainly a grocery store and pharmacy, and very little on other household goods. But they're coming in because the urban market is where they see the value now. So this presentation weaves back and forth. So we're talking about what the Washington, D.C. region has done. We talk about transit-oriented development, and now we're looking at corridor revitalization. And I've talked about, well, why so much traffic? I'm going to bring it back to that level of urban design and street grid now. This is a famous slide from the new urbanist Andre Stwani and his wife Elizabeth Platter-Zyberk, two great architects. And here is your typical arterial. It's just split off. Let's just imagine they're two different neighborhoods across from each other. This is a lot of what we built since World War II, because the car made it easy to do things like this, and real estate got really simplistic, got simple. Everybody did different parts of real estate. Somebody did the mall, somebody else did apartments, somebody else did houses, somebody else, the public did the school or whatever. But all of these all come out to the one main drag. So you can look at Google and you look at your community, and there are parts of Virginia Beach and Norfolk that have great connectivity, other parts have terrible. Obviously, here we have some water issues, too, that affect it and create more of a challenge. But where you can, you want to try to achieve connectivity. And this is nothing new. This is how we used to build our most beloved towns and cities. They had connectivity. You had a mix of activities. Here the housing is back here. It's buffered from the arterial. But you have lots of options for getting around. You can walk. You can bike. You have retail, and then so forth. You might drive for the big errands, but you have options not to drive, and your kid can have more independence. Your children can have more independence. So this illustrates that every trip ends up out on this arterial. This illustrates that you have options not to come out on this arterial. When I look at this region and I hear this talk about many of the mega projects, they're sort of on the fringes of the region, whether it's 460 or something like that. I would think that the day-to-day headaches that people deal with around here that drive people the most nuts are these arterial roads and the traffic delays and so forth they have on these. And so addressing those, fix it first sort of fashion would seem to be more important than anything. Now this is out west, but it could be, anywhere in the country, including around here. Do you notice the pedestrian right there? Now, I think the road was under reconstruction at this time, but they certainly weren't thinking too much about pedestrian safety. They did draw a nice crosswalk for them, but good luck. And Grandpa and Grandma are not going to have an easy time crossing that either. So this is from Jeff Tumlin at Nelson Nygaard, who does great work, and it's a great illustration of the benefits of the street network compared to the arterial. So it's sort of a follow-on to the other slide. So here's all the activities. Here are the parking lots sized exactly based upon the parking ratios typical suburbs require for these uses. And there's our first trip of the day from our home. We drop the kids off at school. We go to work. We leave work, go back to school, pick up the kids for after-school activities. We go shopping while they're in after-school activities. We come back to pick them up, and we go home for dinner. All right, now this is simplified, no question, but just multiply this by a lot of people who may have to do this, and those are all the turning movements on the corridor. And left-hand turns are deadly for traffic congestion in terms of slowing things down, right? So how about the grid? How about we put everything on the grid, like in that other slide I had shown you earlier? We have less parking, because now we can park once. We have shared parking. Again, this is sized according to shared parking. We drive in from our community. We park once now. Kids walk to school. We walk to work. They walk across because we've set up the rec center somewhat approximate to the school. We've gone to work, and we go shopping and come back to the car. They come back to the car, and we all go home for dinner. And that's two turning movements. The results is half the land for parking, well, half the amount of parking, half the land area, 1/4 of the arterial trips, 1/6 the arterial turning movements, and 1/4 vehicle miles traveled. So when we talk about solving traffic congestion, to me this is one of the better illustrations of how important the street network is and how important mixed use is and some of the other benefits. And that's really the theme of this whole thing. Let's add a light rail line in here. Let's come on in and go shopping, go to school, go to work, all from the train, go do all of our activities, and let's get back on the train and go home. So now we haven't made a single trip on this arterial in this case. Again, not everybody is going to do this, but often it only takes about 5% reduction in vehicle trips and vehicle miles traveled to improve the performance of a roadway. Giving people choices and options can make a real difference for roadways. And then there's the live near where you work piece of it, especially for the young professional, the empty nester, and so forth. And then all your trips are walking. I like this illustration because this is a new, recent study from Maryland, from Kittleson and Associates, another fine transportation planning firm. This is an area where they've got a lot of traffic on a couple of these arterials. This intersection has 5,580 intersecting vehicles coming across here. There's a lot of empty spaces in this area. They want to revitalize it, and they want to address traffic on these couple of arterials. So they looked at an internally connected streets with a moderate increase in density, here shown there with 7.3 million square feet, more housing units. The number of entering vehicles in this intersection drops because you have all these other options. So you've added more development and you've got fewer cars at what had been a troubled intersection. You create density and mix of uses. Here's some great medium density examples. It's a little bit like Rockville Town Center to me. Creating boulevard type streets is possible, and you also still have your residential and your open space as part of all of this. If you go to even a higher density, a few more connections across the arterial, and then measure that intersection, looks like this went off, that's supposed to be right there, you're down to even fewer vehicles coming through there, even with more density, because again, you're creating more choices and options. And here's it in bar graph form. Current status quo, adding a diversity and a medium density, adding some more density and greater diversity of connections, and you're actually dropping the congestion here. And I don't know if I mentioned it earlier, that's what Arlington County has seen with its high density development, that they have seen traffic flat, not really increasing at most of their intersections in the Rosslyn-Ballston corridor. And so what you're doing by creating this grid is you get better speed management, you get more walkable blocks, more choices for how to get around throughout this, and you actually get increased traffic capacity. A series of 2-lane roads has more traffic capacity than a 4-lane road. If you had two 2-lane roads, they would have more capacity than a 4-lane road. And Ian Lockwood has shown me that from the Institute for Traffic Engineers manual. This is happening in other parts of the region as well. This happens to be in Charlottesville-Albemarle area, where Route 29 is a disaster. Lots of shopping built up and down it, everybody taking 29. They've widened it to 10 lanes in some parts a decade ago, and still there's traffic, surprise, surprise. What they realized is they didn't have a grid. So their first plan is create a grid to get about 40,000 or more trips off of the main stem of 29. They find even with the grid, they still may have to do a couple of grade separate interchanges, but these are not your father's grade separated interchanges. These are not cloverleafs. These are pedestrian friendly ones. They have really tight cross sections as diamonds. They're urban diamonds. Let me show you what they look like. This is a real picture of the way the road looks today. Let's see, how many lanes is that? It's 4. It's like 6 counting the turn lanes right there on one side alone. So it's probably 10 to 11 total. The sidewalk is particularly fun. I don't know if I'd want to walk along next to 55-mile-per-hour cars. This is a future that they've looked at. So here's that grade separated interchange done as a tight diamond type shape. Harder turn lane that makes you sort of slow down more. Sidewalk is buffered more. There's some other traffic calming devices. We're starting to see some streetscape improvements. Evolves, we build the buildings up to the street here as part of it, so we're getting additional economic development. And this density allows these owners of these shopping centers to dedicate land for the rest of the grid. And that's the deal they're making. We're going to give you additional economic yield if you'll help us create the street grid we've always needed and haven't had. And then it can get even better than it was there. And you can still have huge car carrying capacity, but still have a better urban environment and better economic development. So you're trying to convert this type of stuff, and this is an old-fashioned, very small road compared to the way we build today, to places more like this. Then bringing it down to some other examples, what do we do with the mall? There's tons of failing malls in America today. Usually in the old days, they were out-malled by the next mall. Now they're out-malled by the lifestyle center, which is sort of a knockoff of new urbanist traditional neighborhood development. But we're starting to get more real things where you actually do have residences over stores and things like that. This is Colorado. You know, they've gotten some of these dying malls. This is the plan for how to redo it. Sometimes they save some of the original parts of the building. Often the anchor tenants don't like to leave. And this is what it looks like today. A very different experience than the park walk across the big shopping center piece. And then it's got streets then that can have festivals and so forth. This is out in Belmar, Colorado. Back in Virginia, this is Columbia Pike, an area needing revitalization. It was a Metro Rail option when in the 60s and 70s, but it went to the other corridor instead. They've got a great bus system on here, 16,000 trips a day on that bus system, best in Virginia, but they're looking at a streetcar. But they're also looking at designing it together. And this is Dover Cole Architects doing a redesign for Columbia Pike years ago. This is designing in public. These are midweek sessions where you could stroll in and help them craft the design, get the kids involved. and it's about their future. So we're trying to design together. They came up with different concepts for different nodes along the corridor. People did their own drawings and illustrations of what they wanted to see, which buildings with retail and so forth. And you're trying to create great environments. It's all about the environment for the individual at the street level. Anytime you try to walk along a big arterial in suburban America, think about what it feels like. Do you feel like you're invited to be there as a pedestrian? Do you feel safe, or do you feel isolated? Do you feel at risk from the cars or not? But, where we can create these great places with ground floor retail, with lots of activities and so forth, where we give pedestrians a great realm to live in, you get lots of people. You build it, they will come. And you can get great residential streets. This is in D.C., where you see great residential streets. Here you also see the sidewalks that we're retrofitting into D.C. Bicycling is almost often the most efficient way to get around a city nowadays, and in many even small towns as well. It's one of the most cost-effective transportation systems out there because of the speed and the low cost of bicycles. You can do high-rise buildings and not even know they're there, like this here. There's a high-rise to the right, high-rise apartment building because of the buffer. And you can create sidewalks that are big enough to have great cafes. Here's a Whole Foods with an awful lot of bikes at it. It was the first urban Whole Foods in the nation, parking underground and above on the roof. And you create other places with markets and so forth that are great places to hang out. Or this one, and I think this is Bethesda Row in Bethesda. This is downtown D.C. on the U Street Reviving Corridor. This is technically a high-density building because it fills up the whole lot, but you can see it's of medium-density scale. And you're also a big part of creating these great communities is not to forget the green, whether it's linear greenways for bikes and walkers and so forth, or the town greens, the center squares and so forth, or the small pocket parks where you can just sit down and have lunch or read. Big part of it. Now turning back to where we are here in Virginia Beach. I was told, you're coming from the future, talk about, the problems you have and what you've learned and so forth. But again, like I said, I come here very encouraged because of the amount of work that your planners are doing, your community is doing, looking to the future. This is from your latest comprehensive plan, clearly showing the green line and the very strong effort you've made for a long time to preserve farmland, areas that are low-lying anyway, and you wouldn't want to build there, but also a great resource for nearby local food as farmers markets and local food are proliferating. Plus, you don't have to build infrastructure if you're not doing development there. But you've got this spine here for your smart growth areas, your development areas, follows your interstate. Of course, the one economic engine, two economic engines here in terms of Oceana and the beach. But I think the important thing as you're looking ahead is that, the military, you can't depend on entirely as your economic engine, particularly as our country may downsize a lot of its government, including the military, as part of what we're doing as we make major adjustments. I was prepared to be skeptical of the light rail line largely because in other places where they've bought a railway corridor, an existing railway corridor, it hasn't necessarily tied to where the economic development was. Some parts of the Metro line are that way in D.C. People didn't want it in College Park or in their historic downtown, so they pushed it over to the rail corridor. And that means it's not been as effective at those places. They haven't gotten development. They haven't improved the tax base. But when you look at yours and how it goes right down the heart of everything, it's close to strong road infrastructure already. It goes through places where you have major retail centers. It ties, of course, to your beach hub. It ties to your budding town center. A very effective route, very fortunate that in this case this freight rail line ran right through the middle, and that for this price of $40 million you're able to get a line that is largely dedicated except for the last part through the city streets of Virginia Beach and the crossings. Most cities would really love to have this opportunity to have both that great straight rail line and the proximity to where you can do development. A few years ago, Robert Cervero came here, an expert on transit-oriented development, and he was concerned that Norfolk and Virginia Beach weren't thinking about the development side of it together, the economic development, the urban planning, design thing. I think everybody took it to heart, and as they've really thought and worked harder on this, they're getting ahead of things now with station area planning. And as you go forward and try to seek approval from the federal government, it's going to be critical to have real plans for these station areas to show that you know what you're doing, and that you'll be able to capitalize on that taxpayer and private and local investment in this transit line. So those match up with your strategic growth areas, your smart growth areas I like to call them, and pretty closely. and for a quarter mile, half mile. And again, if you create great environments and even some other circulator systems, you can draw from even a larger area. It works well too with the limitations and the challenges you have from your great environmental assets, your water assets, because you, and I know that I think here you're looking, your consultant is looking at what are these connecting transit systems that can come up to this spine. And that would be the natural way to go, to work around the airfield and to work on the spines of land in between the water. I think it makes a lot of sense from what I'm seeing. And then from an urban design perspective, like I said, you're getting it all right. You're looking at the street networks and you're looking at land that is already paved, that is available for redevelopment, that could really give you a net win-win economically. Your plan for the Alaskans Road Gateway, you know, to go from here to there is a great gain. And I see it's phased in some ways because you have must have a successful store here with parking. So this illustration shows how this can evolve. It's still there with the parking, but you're filling in this block, and eventually this would fill in as well, trying things like roundabouts coming in. You know, I've looked at the, you know, you're getting the road cross sections that are important, the two-way streets. These are 11-foot lanes, which is a great idea, not the 12-foot lanes like VDOT used to build. Side of the street parking, good sidewalks and so forth, good connectivity. You have bump outs along these roads too, that makes it safer for pedestrians to cross here. And Dan Burden and others will talk about that when they come to speak to you about the design of the streets themselves. You're investing in all the right things that you need, the new modern stormwater treatment, you're upgrading your utilities and your water and sewer as part of this. And what you'll find is your public investment will return many times in private economic development. This is a great medium density picture of development, some nice design, and I'm actually relieved to see this is not like we're seeing in the DC area. I'm so tired of red brick, I can't tell you. And here you can do something, your beach community, it's new, it's vibrant, you face the ocean, you can do bright architecture as part of it. Looking at how you can create boulevard feel and great streets, great sidewalks as part of it. Changing places to make them more friendly to pedestrians. I mean, there's a stark difference. This place here, you didn't think about the pedestrian very much, and here, especially with all the carousing in Virginia Beach, it's probably a lot safer for that pedestrian at night than that way. And great streets. I mean, these are great illustrations if you can ensure that the private sector builds to these great designs, and I think the form-based code will help you do that. So I love a lot of these illustrations. They show you're thinking about urban design and street connectivity as you go forward. So I will stop there. I covered a lot of ground, tried to weave a lot of things in here. But if I leave you with anything, it's that we are facing a perfect storm. We face an energy challenge that risks our economic and national security. So it would be nice to get much more efficient in our use of energy. One way is we do that, especially in transportation, is by where and how we grow and how we design our communities. We add to that we have an infrastructure crisis with our aging infrastructure. So there's a lot of benefits from doing redevelopment in the parking lots that we already have to retrofit our infrastructure. Next piece is we're broke. We don't have a lot of economic assets and resources right now. We'd like to, repay some of our debts as a nation. So let's use our infrastructure dollars much more wisely. And I think fixing it first is a big part of it. Thinking about creative land use and transportation solutions is a big part of it. Focusing development and creating lots of opportunities and choices for getting around with the light rail system is a part of it as well. And then lastly, we have changing demographics that is, according to the real estate industry, really changing the market demand, the desire to downsize, live in more walkable communities. And even if we're still in a single-family house, a lot of people would like to have that old Main Street like we had in the small towns, and we're trying to bring those back as well. So we have a lot of challenges, but Americans have always risen to great challenges. And this is, out of these challenges often comes our most creative cycles. And I think we also have a lot of opportunities. And I'd conclude by saying we learned a lot in Northern Virginia. We're doing a lot of great things in Northern Virginia and D.C. But what I'm seeing here with where your planning is going, if you can pursue it and to implementation, is you're headed very much in the right direction. Thank you. How much in terms of questions? 40 minutes. We got plenty of time for questions. So this is the best part of it. So.
One of the advantages that you mentioned for D.C. is that they have a very strong government-sponsored industry and government-sponsored transportation. In fact, particularly the subway system. It not only was purchased by the federal government, but it doesn't even sustain itself. It requires that the federal government continue to subsidize ridership. That's a condition where we have a very stable industry base and tremendous growth because of it. Virginia Beach is faced with, unfortunately, a different problem. We are likely to lose some of our military support, and that seems to be coming fairly quickly. In addition to that, JFCOM is part of military that's now going away. Whether or not we lose a carrier, that's how you look at it. But the fact is that our industry is not as nicely subsidized by the federal government. Furthermore, the D.C. area is a much larger population base and a much denser area than we have. So the worry of all this is that we may be making a very heavy investment that may be very hard to sustain, and I'm thinking particularly of light rail, but also looking for other ways for people to get around. Our industry is generally spread out in this area, other than the bases where the military is, or the base at the ocean front. So we do have a lot of commuter traffic, and it continues to grow, but our population base is not growing. Virginia Beach 10 years ago and Virginia Beach today, very little growth. It's amazingly small compared to other areas. So some of these factors weigh against having the investment to pull off what you've portrayed. And I just wanted to bring that up to get your ideas as it portrays to us.
Well, that's a great question, or series of questions and issues. I think it reinforces exactly why you have to plan for the future, that you have to shape your own destiny and your own future. What we're seeing from experts around the world is regions are competing against each other. It's become increasingly competitive. And regions that are, we're headed to a knowledge economy. It's very much, they say, how the U.S. is going to compete with a knowledge economy, with stronger education, technology, and so forth to keep ahead of the curve. The places that are attracting the next generation knowledge worker are the places that create great, vibrant downtowns and centers that are sustainable and green. When young tech employees are mobile and can live anywhere in the world, they're often picking a Portland, Oregon, or Vancouver, Canada, or a Boulder, Colorado. They're trying to pick places that have strong downtowns, but also great recreational opportunities as well. I wouldn't sell yourself short. You've got a beach. Not everybody has a beach in Virginia like this, or in this part of the Mid-Atlantic. You have amazing water resources in general that you can take advantage. So on the one hand, it's celebrating your green infrastructure that you do have and taking advantage of it. And another, it's tying that to creating a great sense of place and vibrant centers within your community that will attract that next generation of worker, or even attract the older generation worker who may be downsizing from another part of the country, says, I want that fresh air near the coast, and I'm going to keep on working, but I'm going to bring my knowledge, my talents, and what's left of my 401k with me, to your community, because you created a sense of place. I think light rail, above ground light rail, is a heck of a lot cheaper and a big difference from the cost of a heavy rail system. I think this one line, even if it's the only one you ever build, is in the right place and can create that right opportunity for you. I would say that for your freight movement and so forth, it would gain advantages if more of our pesky automobiles were out of their way, because we had other options for moving around and other options for transportation. That's the Dutch approach. They have such a huge port system in the Netherlands that they depend on their freight movement. They've wanted to get their commuters other options so that their trucks can move in and out of the port of Rotterdam and so forth. So there can be some advantages to your other industries by doing this, by focusing growth and reducing traffic. And then from a regional scale, yes, it'll be undermined if the region as a whole decides, well, we're going to do that plus keep spreading out. because that will undermine your market for these transit station areas. And I think, though, that because of the real estate crisis and because of the cost of driving, we are not again going to see as much ex-urban growth as we have seen in the last 2 decades. And that's, again, what a lot of the real estate consultants say. That super big house, very far from work, is going to become much less likely because of the inconvenience and the cost of it. So that will enhance, again, the market for this. But you really do have to make sure you have all the things in place to, good street networks, good zoning plans, good implementation plan. You target your public resources to these areas. You create the right incentives for the private sector. It'll take time. I mean, these are 20-year plus plans as they evolve, but I think they're starting to evolve much faster now as well. Other questions? And if anybody wants to go on deck while this person's coming up, that can work too.
For the most part, among those politically active here in Virginia Beach, there's pretty much a consensus that this is the direction we need to move. My question to you is, how to the average resident out there who has little, if any, involvement in such community meetings or such, how do you sell this to them?
Mm-hmm. Well, and then I probably should go to the Hampton Roads Community Center for Community Engagement. No, but I've been involved in this business for a long time, and getting the public excited and involved is a really important part of this, using every medium you can have possible, whether it's an in-person forum. The taping this, of course, and showing it on cable is a big part of that. Interviews on the radio. Walking tours we found have been very important, and of course all the new media, the internet, the emails, the fancy email communications we have today, the Facebooks and the Twitters. It's all going to be part of it. And I think what we've found in many regions of the country, and I don't know how expansive your comprehensive plan outreach was, but I think there's been a lot of outreach over the last few years to a large part of the community. What they're finding in places as diverse as Portland, Oregon, and Salt Lake City is that with good public marketing information, you can get lots of people involved. And when you present the choices we face to everybody, people do get more involved. You could have a choice where, and this gentleman talked about Virginia Beach's population growing very slowly. That reminds me of Arlington. They felt they had a crisis, that they were not growing, that they were not expanding their tax base, their population, and they were in decline, like many older suburbs. And they took the bull by the horns and shaped their own future. So you talk about what the possible futures of the region could be, and imagine scenarios. I mean, and imagine if a couple of the carriers are moved out and Oceana closes or something, very drastic like that. And and you think about what your fallback is. Are you port maybe, but what else are you? I think though these exercises are very important, and people like to think about the future together like that. That's how I'd sell it. And, you may not get everybody involved, but you'd get a lot involved. Todd, did you want to say anything more about the types of things that you guys are trying to do to get people involved with transportation and so forth? Or save it?
That's one way, but we're not picking certain things to sell.
Right. You're gonna get people involved and up to speed on the issues. Yeah. One thing we find with Americans, of course, like others, if there's something against, it's a lot easier to get motivated and come out for. It's harder to be for something on a consistent basis. But we found in many communities, as people work together and work across sectors, conservation and business, civic communities, and say housing providers, you do get some real excitement going as people work together and solve problems.
Good evening, Stewart.
Hey, Fred.
I'm Fred Adams. We've met in the past a couple of times.
Absolutely.
My point is we're getting a lot of information about how the Norfolk light rail is going. We're recognizing that it's something that's going to have to be subsidized. And we're hearing all kinds of figures. I'm not quite sure where the real truth is, but it's been stated even in the paper that the community would have to subsidize that light rail up to as much as 80%.
That sounds like a real extreme. I recognize the people in this area are really very smart. They're rather cautious. You made the point that we could be losing carriers, and you even suggested that Oceania may close at some time in the future, and I do agree. I think that's not in the too distant future.
Well, hopefully it doesn't. But
we don't have the means, and maybe this organization is the beginning of something where we can come together and really look at how we're going to diversify our economic base. But I'd like to ask you the question, from what we've seen here, do we have to have light rail to do this, or could this not be done with a bus kind of system to get it started?
Again, I haven't reviewed everything in this project, and I know you have an environmental impact study going on that's going to compare the two options. I will say that having the advantage of a dedicated right-of-way is huge to start, and that it can give rail a real advantage in this corridor. I would also say that light rail is much more likely to prompt, from the experience, private sector investment in mixed-use walkable communities and transit-oriented development. They love the permanence of rail when they go to their lenders, that, you know, this city is committed to keeping its transit investment. And, you know, whereas buses could be moved easier, even bus rapid transit. I don't think the bus rapid transit fully proved itself as a development engine yet. I think it can be in the right corridors. I think also for speed, passenger carrying capacity, and probably operating costs, the light rail will probably prove better. But again, wait for the study. As I'm looking at it, some of your spine roads that connect to this, or some of the roads that connect to this spine, could be bus rapid transit or even just some other form of priority bus. To the point of giving it a dedicated lane on your very large arterial roads where it's just for that bus, or the bus gets some priority at signals and things like that. There are different ways to speed buses along. So I would fall, right now as I look at it, I would certainly fall on the side of light rail in this. You have an advantage of having waited. Norfolk went first, and you can learn from the lessons learned. I think what reinforces is that you certainly need to look at every possibility and issue. For instance, I understand they have an issue of the elevation of the tracks, and given flooding that is increasing in the region with sea level rise. One of my specific questions of some of the professionals was, what's the elevation here in this corridor? And it appears that you're in great shape with this corridor. So maybe you're going to, have some economic advantages over Norfolk in the future with your light rail line. But that's another reason why having all the information on the table when you make these big decisions is really important. There are other reasons why you face challenges. I mean, why does the federal government pay 80% of a new highway project and only 50% of a new transit project on the capital side? Why does the state of Virginia pay for all of the maintenance costs for roads and operations for roads, but only give local governments a token amount for the operational costs of transit? I mean, these are our tax dollars in either case, but we're saying something about the priorities we're setting, and I think there's a lot we can do at the state level and the federal level to level the playing field between roads and transit, whether it's the capital investment in the beginning or the operating investment part of it as well. And of course, we know that a lot of our road projects have high long-term costs that are subsidized. They are subsidized just as well. The other gentleman mentioned that. I mean, what's that Springfield interchange going to cost to maintain over its life cycle? So it's about choices. And I think one solid light rail line with very effective transit-oriented development in the corridor, with a very carefully thought out, balanced financing approach to it, I think will prove very effective. And that you should have your best finance minds on it. The federal government should meet a fair share of its needs. The state government should meet a fair share of its needs. I mean, I'm frustrated with the Dulles Rail project in the sense that it's really truly a Northern Virginia and federal project. There's maybe $100 million of state money in a $5+ billion project. There's a $900 million plus from the federal government. All the rest is from toll payers and our local and commercial property taxes for that system. Why is that? I mean, why can't our state spend more to support transit? And in fact, I think it's going to be important for our economic competitiveness and reducing our oil dependency as well. Got another question coming up. Hi.
Virtually all the services that are provided to us are in some way subsidized. And, you know, I'm as cautious as anybody, but to think that a light rail system or any rapid transit system would not be subsidized is a dream. I don't know that there's any system, light rail or whatever, in the country that's not being subsidized. I can't imagine any of them being able to carry their own themselves. You know, the gentleman talked about we could lose a lot of the military situation. Well, what businesses would we attract if we don't become proactive instead of reactive? If we don't do something that makes some sense with our transportation system, it's only going to get worse. We want new businesses. We need to do something.
Yes.
And it certainly appears that this is a logical first step that we need to do. True, Norfolk has done a start. We hopefully will learn a great deal from all of the mistakes, and they made a ton of mistakes during their light rail build. We now have an opportunity to go from that with this dedicated railway that we now own, Virginia Beach, the city of. And you're right, it's a perfect, absolutely perfect place for light rail or rapid transit buses to go. What other choices, and this is my question to you, if we don't go with rapid transit, what other choices does this area have to attract new business and to improve our deteriorating transportation system where our roads are only going to get more and more congested?
I really don't know if you have any. I mean, you can need to do some of the things that you would do with the light rail anyway, which I hope I captured it there, that better local street connectivity, wherever you can do it, can actually make a big difference for your big arterial roads. And now neighborhoods that are been around for a long time may not want a road connection, but at least give the kids and yourselves a pedestrian bicycle path connection in some places. So greater local connectivity. Thinking about how your retail and your communities relate. Are there places with huge retail gaps that could use a neighborhood service, a neighborhood center, you know, a set of neighborhood services that would reduce a few car trips. So these are a lot of incremental things that you can do to give people more choices to make shorter trips. One of the things we're finding in our growing metropolitan regions as traffic has increased, and a study in the DC area showed, their prediction was that over time, accessibility to jobs and housing for places that just had automobile access would continue to go down. But places that had the transit option, especially Metro Rail and some of the other high-capacity bus options, accessibility to jobs and housing would keep going up. It would be improving. So that's another big reason why we're really supportive of layering on the redundancy of another transportation option with a light rail system, with a transit system in there, because it can give you another option. The other thing that happens with congestion, and the reason why land use and urban design and connectivity is important, you know, up to a certain point, hey, it's easy to get around, and, you know, it was in the 60s, 70s, maybe a little bit into the 80s. You know, add a few 100,000 or 1 million more of your friends and neighbors to the area, and the system just breaks down. And what happens often, though, in that process, you survive by narrowing your field of action. Like, I bet in the old days in Northern Virginia, everybody went to Tyson's Corner any time of the day to go to the malls there. I can guarantee you, down where I live in Alexandria, most people in Alexandria never go to Tyson's Corner Mall anymore. You know, they go to Pentagon City Mall, which is even accessible by the rail line in Arlington. Your radius of action shrinks in this situation. If you have huge amounts of traffic congestion, you are not going to win the economic race against other parts of the country or the world. The problem, of course, is money is tight. And the other problem is we've shown you can't build your way out of this on the roadside. What you can do is change your patterns of development, change how we build our communities, and provide these other options. And again, like I said, the way demographics and market demand are changing, if you can create a real sense of place with this light rail system and with your other centers, interconnect them well, and also celebrate your green. with the bike connections, with the the blue trail connections that you could do, you're going to be much more competitive in the marketplace. Hurricanes or no, people love living near the coast. I mean, I get a little nervous when I get too far inland. I don't know if it's my Navy life or whatever, but so you have that ability. But on the other hand, you have a challenge. You're in a sense in a Virginia cul-de-sac here. You're not on the 95 corridor. You're over here. So what's going to bring people here and keep them here? It's the green. It's the fresh air. It's the outdoors you have. But if Virginia Beach, as it ages, looks like any place America, maybe you won't get people. Maybe you'll get that other beach town in Florida somewhere, or South Carolina, which has thought about these ideas and worked through them, will be more competitive in attracting people and their money. So I do think sense of place, good urban design, linking transit and land use and linking the green is going to keep you much more competitive. Now, I'm not an economic development expert, but the other half of this, of course, is envisioning where your economy is going, thinking about what it takes to diversify the economy. Is it green tech? I mean, you've got Eileen from the Sierra Club here talking, the wind power industry. Why should it all be in Spain and China? What a great place to convert from, aviation maintenance to wind turbine maintenance and repair and manufacture and so forth. The benefit of green jobs and green energy as part of this is, they often talk about double and triple bottom lines. Not only are you training a workforce for higher paying and technically oriented jobs often, you're building something that's going to reduce your oil dependency, make you more energy efficient. If you're more energy efficient, perhaps you're also saving money in this process, and you're taking that money and investing in something else that will help our economy and our competitiveness. So there can be, with this next generation of technology and green technology, I think there can be some win-win-wins. Last thing I might say on this, I'm going on a long time on this one, but there are a couple things I forgot during the presentation. We talk a lot about renewable energy, and we talk about the energy production side in the debate, coal versus nuclear versus wind versus solar and so forth. I like to think of it from the user end. And when you look at end users, buildings and transportation combined are about 70 to 80% of our energy use and our greenhouse gas emissions. Buildings and transportation. The nation's starting to do really well on green building, both building green and now increasingly with the weatherization funding and retrofitting our existing buildings is a huge benefit. But that's, say, 40% of it, maybe 45% of the energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions. But when you get to transportation, we're not paying enough attention to it. We could have more efficient cars, and we're working that way. We could have cleaner fuels. But what the research shows, and there's a report called Growing Cooler by Smart Growth America and the Urban Land Institute, Growing Cooler shows that the third leg of the transportation stool is our vehicle miles traveled. If it keeps increasing, we're not going to be able to make ourselves that much more energy efficient. And so you're more energy efficient on transportation if you're creating more efficient patterns of development. And I think as a country and as a region, we should think about how to be more competitive. We spend a lot more money, probably per capita, than any other nation just to move around, to get maybe the same daily needs done. And perhaps if we can save some of that money and save some of that time and put it into building a business, our education, et cetera, we will be more competitive. Uh-oh. I said her name, and now she's up.
Well, I remember I used to live in Loudoun County when they were talking about the metro station out in Loudoun County, that there was absolutely no provisions for commuter parking, that the whole planning process was one where they were hoping that the industry and the businesses and everything that would be there, so there was no planning for commuter parking, and I thought that was absolutely bizarre because I was more in the western hinterlands and I wanted to get into Fairfax, I wanted to get into D.C., and I wanted to have commuter parking in that area. And I'm wondering if that's still sort of the rule of thumb that's applying to Virginia Beach, because certainly, we do want to have the infrastructure or the industry built around, the work environments right within these strategic growth areas. But at the same time, there's no denying that there's also going to be all of us still living out in the Sprawlville that are going to want to, access the jobs in Norfolk, and we're going to want to access the jobs in other areas. So is that part of the mix that our current planners are putting into it? Because I think that's going to be key to its success.
Well, you have to look at it and look at your choices again, there's not a simple answer to this. If you're talking about ridership on the transit system and maximizing ridership on the transit system, the rider who lives near the station and can walk or bike to the station, who doesn't require parking, is more cost effective for the transit system than the one who you have to provide a lot of parking for and give up tax base for that parking to do. So if you're talking about maximizing transit riders in your region and transit ridership on your system, to us the best thing to do is to reward the person who's going to live or work near the transit. So that would be number one. Number two, you need to create great pedestrian and bicycle access to the transit stations to extend the reach of the station so that the walking distance is more than a half mile that people are willing to walk. And you know, in the DC area, the vast majority of people who access the metro rail systems in the suburbs live within 2, maybe 3 miles of the stations. That's a great market for biking, you know, if you have the safe biking coming in. Often cheaper than the parking structures that they've been building in Northern Virginia and Maryland for the suburban stations is even to provide feeder bus service to the stations. And then you have to think about it again. If you're talking about the next increment of people that will move here, you are helping everybody's traffic if you reward the ones who are going to live near transit with that accessibility. It may be that commuter parking is still going to be part of the solution in the right places, but you really have to look at it carefully because, you know, what happens to your traffic congestion? Do you still create as much peak hour trip and congestion problem as people drive, say, north or south to get to the station as you were trying to relieve before? And would those commuters who may be in more dispersed areas be better served by some sort of commuter bus system running on a different route, not all running to the light rail spine, maybe angling over to Norfolk or Portsmouth?
And it could be a phasing in process too. You know, as you're filling in, it's a commuter lot that one day becomes, you know, more of a building or a high rise or something.
Have you ever tried to pry a commuter lot space out of someone's hands?
No, I haven't.
Now, one of the things we have seen with economic development in places, and you'll probably see it with your town center, and I saw it with the Reston Town Center. I first said, what's all this parking around the Reston Town Center? It's kind of, you know, looks like a sort of Disney thing. It's got all this parking. It's not truly a town center. But that was really just land banking. So they had surface parking that they eventually, as the land values rose and the development took place in phases, that got converted to development. And they put the parking either completely underground or in structures that were wrapped. So that can work as well. But again, to answer that, you really have to understand the origins and destinations of your commuters. The best way to serve them, is it better to have them come to a station and then commute in, or to give them a different transit service that will get them maybe there more directly? And we do have people in the metro rail system in Northern Virginia who find that they want to make sure that the bus system allows them direct options as well as the option to go up to a station and then ride in. Our metro system is so crowded now, like European cities, we're having to layer on other types of transit. So even in the Orange Line corridor in Arlington, with all their success, their residents can't really get on the trains because of all the residents from Fairfax and Prince William that are getting on the Orange Line before then. So they've added something called the Orange Line with a View. It's a bus system on the surface streets that takes you all the way into downtown. And so you start to, as you get successful with this type of development, you then add diversity of services and transit services. Other questions? Got one coming? Nobody wants to go on deck at all around here. I tell you what, get ready. That's what the council members and supervisors always do. They get to call them 3 names in a row and you come up.
Hi, my name is Steve Sullivan. Heavily into biking. I'm the president of the Tycoon Bicycle Association. I'm also a director for Virginia Beach's Light Rail now. But that's not what I came up here to say. I lived up in Northern Virginia, Del City specifically, for about a dozen years before I moved down here in 2003. And when I left that area, traffic congestion was roughly about the same as it is down here now. Recently, I had an opportunity, I'm not sure that's quite the right word, to go back to my old neighborhood and commute up to Tyson's Corner for a week. What's happened since 2003, 7 years, is the 26-mile commute that I had for the week took an hour and a half.
Mm-hmm.
Without any kidding, if there was a safe way to bike it, I could have done it faster on a bicycle. My question is, well, one of the things that I noticed is that with the suburban sprawl in the same time period, the housing prices near the stations and I saw a lot of the things you said firsthand. The suburban sprawl also continued and enabled people to move farther out and then commute to the train stations, as you mentioned as well. How do we prevent that mistake here?
Well, fortunately, your station is alignment here is going into the core of the area where you've already grown, and also an area with lots of parking lots and lower density uses that you can revitalize. If you were to run a light rail line due south from it, or if Chesapeake and Suffolk and Isle of Wight were to run one commuter rail line out, say we use the Norfolk Southern line parallel to 460, the rail can have the effect of generating sprawl. You saw that in New England and Philadelphia and those places. You got the great station area communities initially, but then when it was convenient to come to the stations, people did spread out much farther. So in Virginia, it means you need good planning and good zoning in the outer areas if you're going to extend, say, a commuter rail. Before you extend the commuter rail, you better have your agricultural zoning in place. You try to create real sense of place and real towns along the rail corridor if you were going to do something like a commuter rail or another rail extension. That's one piece of it. What you tell me is interesting. It's a reinforcement of why in Northern Virginia accessibility has gotten worse for people who don't have the transit options and better for those who have the transit options. What's happened in prices, and Chris Lineberger of Brookings has written a lot about this. Joe Courtwright has written about this. Chris Nelson, who was at Virginia Tech and now is at University of Utah, has written about this. Is what we're seeing is that in our metropolitan areas, DC is the one I'm most familiar with, prices during the real estate collapse have held up much better in the city, in the inner suburbs close to jobs, and especially near transit because of the convenience of these places. They just sustain their value better. And what's happened is that the biggest hit in terms of foreclosures, drops in prices, and so forth have been in the outermost areas. I think Prince William is in real trouble. It has to reinvent itself as well. It is so spread out, so dependent just on the car. Doesn't really have a lot of good centers or sense of place. I am cautiously hopeful for their North Woodbridge plan right at their VRE station. Places could really use revitalization, and they have a mixed-use, transit-oriented plan for North Woodbridge. And that, again, I think you're going to see people increasingly move to these places. For older suburbs, what will happen, hopefully, is that retirees, seniors will have options to stay in the community because we're creating a different type of housing opportunity for them. And when they leave that single-family home in a neighborhood, say in Virginia Beach, now it's available to that next generation family as well. So that can help us. But I was again in the article I was said to be coming from the future. You saw what happened in the future. You saw what happened to Dale City. It is terrible, and it is starting to have, I'm sure, an economic impact on the state. The commuters are all local, but they're affecting interstate freight probably on I-95, which is important to the state. You cannot count with any reliability on being able to travel between Fredericksburg and Washington now, almost any time of the day and any weekend. I take the train between Richmond and Washington now, and it is so much more reliable. It's a little bit longer. Sometimes it's a little late because of a freight train, but generally you can work, you can get things done, and you don't share that frustration and the variability that occurs between Fredericksburg and Washington. So, from a statewide perspective, investing in the intercity rail is going to be an important part of it. I think the Virginia Department of Rail and Public Transit, who will be coming to speak to you in the last part of this transportation series, has been doing some great work to study all the incremental fixes we need for higher speed rail. I don't think we can afford high-speed rail, the European and Japanese stuff. But just higher speed rail with 90% reliability would make it easier to plan your business meetings and be able to plan to travel. And I think it's going to make a real difference for the state. And then on the freight rail investment, one of the unsung issues in Virginia, although probably much more familiar to people down here, our competitiveness depends on being able to move freight better, and the freight rails are now partnering with the federal and state government. Virginia's a leader in this, I think, in the ability to try to move freight. The Heartland Corridor has been upgraded now, and so I think it's almost done for Norfolk Southern, paralleling 460, and that's going to make a big difference to the port. Other questions? I don't see anybody. I've worn you all out. But I'm happy to come back. I'm really encouraged by what I'm seeing. As I said, Hopefully lots of people will see this video, and let's make it go viral. Why don't you create a little YouTube to go with it too? And up in Arlington, there's a spoof essentially on Arlington called the Arlington Rap, and a local millennial, I'll call him, did the Arlington Rap, and it's tongue-in-cheek making fun of Arlington, which has been very successful. It's very popular, but it's got a lot of things you could make fun of, I guess, in the process. So Arlington also did a video of its own, a documentary of how it did its smart growth, so that's worth looking at. And then get the next generation involved as well, get the young people involved. Ask them what they think and how mobile they feel. I mean, I've had a lot of interns who come to us who've gone to college in Virginia and came, and I asked them what their life was like before, and they said, well, after a certain age and before they got their driver's license, they felt a little trapped. They didn't have the flexibility to get around, and they didn't gain the same sense of independence that people once were able to achieve. So it's that next generation we ought to listen to as well, and to see what they think about the future of Virginia Beach. So thank you.